I want you to understand something before I say another word. I was not a stupid man. I spent 31 years as a police detective in Massachusetts. I interrogated killers. I read people for a living. I caught liars the way other men catch colds easily, automatically, without even trying. I knew when someone was hiding something. I knew when a story didn't add up. I knew the difference between a person who was scared and a person who was performing scared. That was my job. That was my identity. And then I met Ursula Mercado, and every single skill I had built over 3 decades of law enforcement dissolved like sugar in warm rain. I need you to understand that first, because everything that comes after it only makes sense if you understand that a man who should have known better, a man who was trained to know better, was still completely, catastrophically destroyed by a woman he barely knew. 18 months, $375,000, and a marriage that was never real from the first day I said I do. I retired from the department at 62. I didn't want to retire. I had planned to go until 65, maybe longer, but my knees were bad and my sleep was worse, and my captain sat me down one afternoon and said, "Vince, you've given this city everything you have. Go live." I didn't know how to do that. My wife Patricia had left me 9 years earlier. Not because of another man, not because of anything dramatic. She left because she said I had already chosen the job over her so many times that the divorce was just paperwork catching up with a decision I'd made years before. She wasn't wrong. I gave her the house. I moved into an apartment in Worcester with a pull-out couch and a television, and I worked. I worked because work was the only language I spoke fluently. When they retired me, they took my language away. The apartment felt like a holding cell. My daughter Megan called once a week and said she loved me, but she lived in Denver with her husband and her 2 kids and her full life, and I could hear in her voice that she didn't know what to do with me any more than I knew what to do with myself. My son, Patrick, and I hadn't spoken in 4 years over something I'm not proud of, a disagreement about money, about the family, about choices he made that I couldn't accept. I was 62 years old, retired, alone, and the silence in that apartment was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in my life. A colleague from the department, a man named Frank, who had retired 2 years before me, found me at a bar one evening staring at a beer I didn't really want. He sat down and he said, "Vince, I've been where you are. I went to the Philippines last year for 2 months, and I am telling you, it is the most alive I've felt since I turned 40. Frank wasn't talking about women when he said that, or at least that's what I told myself. He was talking about the culture, the warmth, the cost of living, the food, the people. He said people there made him feel human again. He showed me photographs on his phone. He was smiling in every single one. I hadn't smiled like that in years. 3 weeks later, I booked a flight to Manila. I told Megan I was taking a vacation. She said, "Dad, that's wonderful." I didn't tell her how long I was planning to stay. Manila hit me like a wall. The noise, the heat, the traffic, all of it was overwhelming in a way that, strangely, I needed. After the silence of Worcester, the chaos felt like proof that the world was still alive. I spent the first week just walking, eating, adjusting. I stayed in a hotel in Marcato that Frank had recommended, and I started to relax in a way I hadn't in years. I wasn't a detective there. I wasn't a failed husband or a distant father. I was just a man on a sidewalk, eating grilled pork, and watching the city move. On my 9th day, a Friday evening, I went to a restaurant bar near the hotel because Frank had recommended it and because I didn't want to eat alone in my room again. The place was busy, upscale by local standards, and there was a hostess near the entrance who smiled at me when I walked in. Not the automatic smile of someone doing their job, a different kind of smile, the kind that makes a man feel seen. Her name was Ursula Mercado. She was 38 years old, from Quezon City, and she had been working as a hostess at that bar for 3 years. She was beautiful, I won't pretend otherwise, but what got me wasn't her appearance. It was the way she talked. She was intelligent and calm, and she listened to me like what I was saying mattered. I told her I was retired. She asked from what? I said police work. Her eyes went wide, and she said she thought that must have been incredible work, dangerous and important, and I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly. We talked for 2 hours. When I left, she gave me her number without me asking. I looked at that number for 3 days before I used it. We began meeting for dinner, then for walks, then for day trips outside the city. She told me about her life, a difficult childhood, a father who left early, a mother she supported financially, 2 younger brothers who depended on her. She said she had given her 20s and 30s to her family and had not had time for love. She said she had begun to believe love wasn't meant for her. I understood that feeling exactly. I told her so. She put her hand over mine on the table and said, "Maybe we are both wrong about that." I drove back to the hotel that night and sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought, for the first time in 9 years, that maybe Patricia hadn't taken everything when she left. Maybe there was still something left of me that could feel this way. 6 weeks later, Ursula told me she loved me. I said it back before I even decided to. It just came out, the way true things do. Looking back now, I know that 6 weeks was nothing. I know that a man my age with my background should have required far more time than 6 weeks to say those words to someone. But I was 62 and lonely, and she had made me feel in 6 weeks more valued and more seen than I had felt in the final decade of my marriage. I wasn't thinking like a detective. I was thinking like a man who was terrified that if he let this slip away, there would be nothing after it. 2 months after I arrived in the Philippines, Ursula asked me what I was thinking about our future. She said it carefully, gently, the way someone asks a question when they're afraid of the answer. I said I had been thinking about it a great deal. She said her family would need to be involved in any serious commitment. I said I understood. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet. We married 8 weeks after that conversation. I know how it sounds. 2 months of dating and 2 months of talking about the future and then a wedding. My daughter Megan cried on the phone when I told her not from happiness. She said, "Dad, you barely know this woman." I said, "Megan, I know her better than you think." She said, "Please just wait. Please just slow down." I didn't slow down. I convinced myself that what I felt was real and that waiting was for people who were afraid, and I was no longer willing to let fear run my life. The wedding was held at a garden venue in Quezon City. I paid for everything. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the dress, the rings, the celebration dinner for her extended family afterward. When the final bill came, the total was $35,000. I wired the money without hesitation. Ursula looked at me across the courtyard in her white dress, and she smiled. And I told myself that $35,000 was a small price for the rest of my life being different. The honeymoon was in Palawan. Ursula had suggested it. She said it was the most beautiful place in the country, and she had always dreamed of going. I booked the resort myself online, a private villa, excursions, diving, island hopping, 7-star meals every night. I wanted her first experience of that place to be perfect. 10 days in Palawan cost $40,000. I remember writing the number down in my notebook afterward and feeling something not quite alarm but a kind of distant awareness that I pushed aside. Because she was happy. Because she held my hand on every boat and pointed at the limestone formations and said she had never in her life felt this lucky. Because she looked at me on the last night and said, "Vince, I will take care of you forever." That was all I needed to hear. We returned to Manila, and the first serious conversation we had was about where we would live. Ursula said the apartment she had been renting in Quezon City was too small, too far from good schools for any future children, and in a neighborhood that was not safe. I had not thought about children. I was 62. But she spoke about it with such warmth, such quiet hope, that I didn't feel the age gap, I just felt the possibility. She had found an apartment. It was in Makati, near the BGC border, on the 21st floor, with a city view. She walked me through it on a video call, and I could hear the happiness in her voice when she described each room. The setup cost, furniture, deposits, renovations, she said were necessary. Appliances, utilities, connections came to $85,000. I paid it across 3 transfers. When I walked into that apartment for the first time and saw how she had decorated it, how carefully she had arranged everything, how she had already hung a photograph of our wedding day on the wall above the entryway, I told myself that this was not money spent. This was a life being built. The first time I met her family in a formal setting, not the wedding, but a family lunch at the new apartment 3 weeks after we moved in, I counted 14 people. Her mother, 2 aunts, 4 cousins, her 2 brothers and their girlfriends, an uncle, and 2 people whose relationship to her I never fully understood. They were warm and loud, and they ate and laughed and called me Kuya Vince, which I was told was a term of affection. Ursula was glowing. I felt like a man who had been allowed into something real. Her mother pulled me aside after lunch and held both my hands in hers and said, "You are a blessing to this family." I thanked her. I meant it. Over the following 4 months, her family's needs came to me in installments. Her younger brother needed money to start a small transport business, a motorcycle, a license, initial capital. Ursula presented it apologetically, saying she knew it was a lot to ask so soon. I said family is family. The first payment to her brother was $9,000. Then her cousin needed surgery, a procedure that wasn't fully covered, and the family couldn't manage the hospital deposit. I sent $12,000. Then her mother's house in Quezon City needed repairs after a typhoon. I sent $18,000. Then another brother needed help getting out of a debt situation that Ursula described vaguely but urgently, and I sent $16,000 without asking too many questions because I could see how distressed she was. In total, between family emergencies and family needs and family investments, I gave $55,000 to her family in the first 7 months of our marriage. Each time, Ursula thanked me with tears in her eyes and said she would spend her whole life making it up to me. Each time, I told her there was nothing to make up. At the 7-month mark, Ursula came to me with an opportunity. A friend of hers, a businesswoman she described as trustworthy and established, was expanding a food and beverage operation in Cebu and needed a partner investor. Ursula said it was a chance for us to build something together, a passive income stream that could support us both in the long term, particularly given my retirement income wouldn't stretch indefinitely. She was right about that. My pension and savings were substantial, but they were not unlimited. She spoke about the business with knowledge and confidence, profit margins, foot traffic, franchise potential. I asked her how much the investment was. She said $80,000 for a 40% stake. I asked to see documentation. She produced a business proposal, a registration document, a profit and loss projection. I read through it carefully. I told myself I was doing due diligence. I told myself that 31 years in law enforcement had given me the ability to spot a fraudulent document. What I didn't account for was that the documents were professionally made, that Ursula's calm confidence throughout the conversation was practiced, and that my desire to believe we were building something real together had completely overridden the analytical part of my brain. I wired $80,000 to an account Ursula provided. I never met the businesswoman friend. The business in Cebu did not exist. I didn't know that yet. For 2 more months, Ursula gave me occasional updates about the business, positive ones, progress reports, talk of the opening date being pushed back slightly, but everything on track. I was worried about something else by then. I had noticed, gradually, that Ursula was on her phone more than she used to be. Not dramatically more, just slightly. She would angle it away from me when she texted. She would step into the other room to take calls she said were from her mother. Once, when she left her phone on the kitchen counter and walked out to the balcony, I saw a name on the screen that I didn't recognize a man's name, and a message that was cut off before I could read more than 3 words. I didn't confront her. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that I was a jealous old man looking for problems because I couldn't believe that something good had happened to me. That internal dialogue, that constant self-dismissal, was one of the most effective weapons she had against me, and she hadn't even had to teach it to me. I had built it myself, out of insecurity and longing, before she ever used it. 8 months into the marriage, Ursula told me she wanted to study. She said she had always regretted not finishing her degree, and that now that she had stability in her life, she wanted to complete her education. She had already researched a program, a business management degree at a university in Manila, 2 years, evening classes so she could still manage the home. She said the tuition and materials and related costs were $45,000 over the 2 years, but that she wanted to pay the full amount up front because the school offered a discount for full payment. She showed me the school's website. She showed me a brochure. She showed me an admissions letter with her name on it. I was proud of her, genuinely proud. I told her that education was the best investment a person could make and that I was happy to support it. I paid $45,000. She enrolled, or she appeared to enroll. She left the apartment 3 evenings a week and came home with textbooks and said she was tired. I made her tea and asked her about her classes, and she told me things that sounded like things a business management student would say. I had no way of knowing whether any of it was real. 10 months into the marriage, I called Megan. I hadn't spoken to her properly in weeks. She picked up on the second ring and said, "Dad, I've been worried about you." She asked how things were going. I said they were fine, that Ursula was well, that Manila was growing on me. Megan was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I need to ask you something directly and I need you to answer me honestly. How much money have you spent since you got married?" I told her I didn't want to talk about finances. She said, "Dad, please." I gave her a vague number. I watched her go silent on the other end of the line, and then she said, "Please come home. Just come for a visit. Just let me see you." I said I would think about it. I didn't go home. 11 months in, I ran into Frank, my old colleague from the department who had told me about the Philippines in the first place. He was back in Manila for another visit, and we had dinner near Marcato. I told him about the marriage. He was careful with his reaction. He didn't say what I think he wanted to say. But he asked me questions. Quiet, careful questions. The way a detective asks questions when he already suspects the answers. He asked how I'd met Ursula. I told him. He asked about her family. I told him. He asked about the money gently, in a way that made it sound like casual conversation. By the end of dinner, I had told him roughly how much I'd spent across the year. He looked at me for a long moment and he said, "Vince, I'm going to say something and I need you not to get angry at me." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I've heard this story before." He said he had a friend who had gone through something similar and that there were organized operations. He called them what I later came to know as romance scams, but more sophisticated, longer term, involving real relationships, real marriages, even that specifically targeted retired Western men through dating sites, using women who were trained to engage them, move fast, marry quickly, and extract money across a compressed timeline before moving on. I sat across from Frank, and I felt a rage rise in me that was directed entirely at him. I told him he didn't know what he was talking about. I told him that Ursula was not that. I told him that what we had was real and that he was being insulting. I left the restaurant before the check came. I didn't speak to Frank again for months. I have spent the last 11 years regretting that dinner, not because of what Frank said, but because of how I responded. 13 months in, Ursula told me there was a medical emergency. Her brother, one of the brothers, not the one with the transport business, a different one, had been diagnosed with a condition that required immediate surgery and post-operative care. The hospital needed a deposit before they would admit him. She was crying when she told me. Real crying, or what looked exactly like real crying, the kind that makes your throat close up and your hands shake. I held her and told her it would be okay. I asked how much was needed. She said $35,000. I wired it the next morning. Later, much later, after everything had ended, I would learn that this brother, and indeed the entire medical emergency, had been constructed. There was no surgery. There was no hospital deposit. There was simply a phone call between Ursula and her mother, and a number they had decided on, and a performance delivered in our living room, with enough emotional accuracy to convince a 31-year veteran of law enforcement that he was watching genuine grief. 14 months in, I started going through the bank statements more carefully. Not because I was suspicious. I told myself I was just organizing, just being financially responsible. What I found, when I laid out all the transfers and expenses across the 14 months, was a number so large that I had to check it 3 times. I had spent, across the wedding, the honeymoon, the apartment, the family payments, the business investment, the education fees, and the medical emergency, approximately $340,000. My retirement savings, which I had protected and invested carefully across decades, had been reduced to almost nothing. I sat at the kitchen table with the statements spread across it, and I did not feel rage. I felt a cold, terrible clarity, the same clarity I used to feel at a crime scene when all the pieces suddenly formed a shape. I knew the shape I was looking at. I had seen it many times before. I had just never been inside it. I did not confront Ursula that evening. I didn't confront her the next day either. I watched her. I watched her in the way I had watched suspects, quietly, without showing anything on my face, cataloging every small behavior. The way she held her phone, the way she smiled at me a little too naturally when I came into the room, the way she mentioned her brother's recovery without me asking. At 15 months, I hired a local investigator through a firm I found online. I told myself I was being paranoid. I paid the investigator and asked him to look into the business in Cebu, the university enrollment, and Ursula's background. He came back to me 2 weeks later with a report that I read sitting on a bench in a park near the apartment because I couldn't read it inside, in the space where we lived. The business in Cebu did not exist and never had. The account I had wired the $80,000 to had been emptied and closed within 48 hours of my transfer. The university had no record of Ursula Mercado as a student in any program for the past 2 years, and her background, her history, before she started working at the bar where I met her, included a pattern. 3 previous relationships with older foreign men, all of which had ended with significant financial transfers and the man returning home. None of them had been her husband. I had been the first man she had actually married. I went back to the apartment. I made dinner. We ate together at the table we had bought with my money. In the apartment I had paid $85,000 to set up, and Ursula told me about something her cousin had said that was funny, and I laughed in the right places, and inside I was completely hollow. 2 days later I told her I knew. I sat down across from her at that same table after breakfast, and I laid the investigator's report between us, and I said, I know about the business. I know about the university. I know about the men before me. And I want you to tell me the truth. Just once. I just want to hear the truth. She looked at the report for a long time. And then she looked up at me. And what I saw in her face was not shame. It was not grief. It was a kind of quiet appraisal, like she was calculating the next move, deciding which story still had value. She said, Vince, you don't understand the pressure I have been under. She said her family had obligations, that she had done what she had to do, that she had feelings for me that were complicated. I said, did your family target me specifically? Did they find me on that dating site? She looked away. She said, my uncle found your profile. She said it without apology. She said it the way someone states a fact that is simply part of how things are done. I left the table and I went into the bedroom and I sat on the floor because the bed was too soft and I needed something solid under me. I sat there for a very long time. At month 16, I began the legal process of ending the marriage. A lawyer I retained in Manila told me the process would take time, that Philippine divorce law was complex, that I should prepare for difficulty. I told him to do what needed to be done. Ursula did not fight the separation. She had already stopped coming home most evenings. The apartment, the one I had paid $85,000 to furnish, she was emptying it slowly, piece by piece, each time she came back for things. I watched it happen, and I didn't stop it because the furniture meant nothing to me, and fighting over it would have required me to feel something more than what I was capable of feeling at that point. What I felt at that point was a deep, settled numbness that was, in its own way, worse than pain. Megan flew to Manila when I finally told her what had happened. She didn't say I told you so. She sat across from me at a table in a cafe near the hotel I had moved into, and she held my hands across the table the way I held them when she was a little girl and afraid of something, and she said, Dad, I'm going to get you home. She had brought Patrick with her. My son, who I hadn't spoken to in years, was sitting in that cafe in Manila, and when I walked in and saw him, I felt something in my chest that was completely different from what I'd been feeling for months. Not numbness, not hollow, something living and painful and grateful. We didn't talk about what had come between us, not that day. We just sat together, and Megan made a plan, and Patrick helped me pack up what remained of the apartment. When we left the building, I didn't look back at it. At 17 months, I was back in Massachusetts. Megan had set up a room for me in the spare bedroom of her and her husband's house in Worcester. It was a temporary arrangement, she said. It became something longer. I sat in that room for weeks and did not know what to do with my hands. A counselor I started seeing, a woman Megan found, experienced in working with people who had been through scams and financial manipulation, told me that what I had experienced was a form of targeted fraud that was also a form of abuse. She said the combination of loneliness, romantic attachment, and manufactured trust was one of the most effective and destructive confidence operations in existence, and that it had broken people far less isolated than I had been. She said I should not blame myself for not seeing it. I told her I had been a police detective for 31 years. She said that almost makes it harder, not easier, because people in that profession learn to read other people's motives in operational contexts, under pressure, in interrogation, in crisis, not in conditions of personal vulnerability and love. She said love disarms the analytical mind in ways that have nothing to do with intelligence. She said the people who run these operations know that better than anyone. I listened to her. I went back the following week. I kept going. The total amount I lost across 18 months of marriage to Ursula Mercado was $375,000. I have gone through that number so many times, broken it down into its components so many times, tried to understand at what point I could have stopped it, that the number has become almost abstract to me now. The wedding that cost $35,000, the honeymoon at $40,000, the apartment at $85,000, the family at $55,000, the fake business at $80,000, the degree she never pursued at $45,000, the fake surgery at $35,000, and smaller amounts I haven't even accounted for here, daily expenses and gifts and things I bought because I was in love and wanted her to be happy. $375,000 is not just money. It was my retirement. It was the financial foundation I had spent 30 years building so that my last decades would be comfortable and free. It is gone. I am 73 now. I live carefully. I am not destitute. My pension still comes in, and Megan has helped me stabilize, but the cushion is gone, and the freedom it would have represented is gone, and there is no realistic way to rebuild it at my age. What I think about most, though, is not the money. What I think about is the 18 months. That is what I cannot stop turning over, because 18 months is exactly long enough to fall in love, exactly long enough to stop asking questions, exactly long enough to believe that you are someone's husband, someone's partner, someone's future. And apparently, it is also exactly long enough to run a complete and systematic operation against a man, strip him of his financial security, and walk away without turning back. Ursula's family, her uncle who found my profile, her mother who held my hands and called me a blessing, her brothers who received my wire transfers and gave nothing back. They ran an 18-month schedule with precision, every request timed, every emergency calibrated, every expression of love deployed at exactly the moment it was needed to keep me from seeing clearly. 18 months was the plan. I was never a husband. I was a timeline. Patrick and I have rebuilt something. Not everything, we probably never will, but something. He came back to Massachusetts twice in the following year, and we sat together and talked in ways we never had before, not even when he was young. He didn't ask me to explain how I let it happen. He just showed up. That mattered more than anything he could have said. Megan still worries about me. I see it when she looks at me sometimes, a quiet fear that I am not fully here, that the man who went to the Philippines is not the same man who came back. She's right that I'm not the same man. But I want her to know, and I want anyone listening to this to know, that different does not always mean worse. I came back knowing something I didn't know when I left. Not about Filipino women, not about the Philippines, because that country did nothing wrong, and the people I met there who were kind and genuine far outnumbered the ones who weren't. What I came back knowing was about myself, about how deep the loneliness had been, about how desperately I had needed to believe that it was possible to still be loved at 62, about how that need, unexamined and unmanaged, had been a door I left open. She didn't break into my life. I let her in, completely and urgently and without the caution I would have applied to anything else, because I was afraid that if I waited too long the chance would be gone. There is a man somewhere right now sitting in a bar in Manila or Cebu or Quezon City, across from a woman who is smiling at him in a way that makes him feel seen for the first time in years. He is thinking about how different this is from home. He is thinking about how much he has to offer and how good it feels to be wanted. He is maybe 45 years old or 60 or 70, and he has money in the bank and hope in his chest and no idea. I want to be the voice he hears for just one moment before he wires anything. Not to tell him to stop. I don't believe in telling people to stop loving. I want to tell him to go slow. Slower than feels comfortable. Slower than she asks for. Slower than his loneliness will try to allow. The love might be real. It might be exactly what it feels like. But the only way to know is time. And time is the one thing a man my age feels he cannot afford to waste. That feeling is itself the trap. I know that now. I wish I had known it before. $375,000 before, 18 months before, a marriage and a future before, but I know it now, and I will spend whatever years I have left making sure the knowing wasn't for nothing.